So, Manick, the last time we spoke, you were moving out of London and going towards the south coast. How have you found that move?
As a Londoner, yeah, it was quite a challenge, but I think last year really did just make me think about London and what London has become, and my love of London slightly fading away a bit. Although it's like a lover, once you kind of leave London, you start to pine for it sometimes.
Mm.
But Hastings, what I like about Hastings is that it's still got sort of that buzz of sort of what elements of London had. It's kind of rough at the edges, but it's kind of got a nice mix of people who, you know, kind of found a bit of an escape, really,
Mm.
and built up something.
Yeah.
I like it's kind of, there's a bit of a hedonism to it too, which maybe London's slightly lacking, and there's something that's a bit retro and vintage about it. There's something that's a bit, you kind of just walk down some roads which is full of characters owning junk shops, and then you go to the old town, and it's kind of got all these kind of, I suppose, increasingly more shishi shops, and restaurants now. And so Hastings is changing without a doubt, but it's got a lovely history. I like its history to the Norman invasion, the history to its piracy, um,
Mm.
the Robert Trussell, the guy who wrote the Ragged Trouser Philanthropist.
Yep.
I think wrote that in Hastings. John Logie Baird, who created, inventor of television, and so I like it. There's some real characters there, and actually people are really friendly.
Mm.
You walk into a pub and they talk to you.
Yeah. I've always,
Yeah,
I've
people
always
talk to
found, I've always found that the good balance of sort of city, not necessarily city life, but that kind of buzz, but also the sort of austere beauty of rural England is found in like kind of market towns and coastal towns where it's yeah, it does get that right blend. It's like you get like a city feel, but you still know your neighbors.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have to be careful, so because knowing your neighbours can be a bit like you get a feeling of being watched. If you do anything wrong, people might know about
Mm.
it.
Was it
But I
was
do like it. It's a lovely little town, and
mm.
there's some things that could be improved upon. I think the litter's appalling in this territory.
Right? Yeah, yeah.
People, well, yeah. I mean, I think they just pick on the bins and stuff like that. So could do with the cleanup.
Was there a culture shock for you? I've read a lot about Londoners who moved to sort of more provincial England, and that they sort of the mindset of where you grew up never really leaves you. So did you find that sort of did you find there was a big sort of difference in people's thinking down there?
Well, there's a lot of Londoners that
Mm.
moved to Hastings.
Right,
Quite a lot of people I meet in the pubs, went, "Oh yeah, another Londoner."
expats, yeah.
And then the ones I speak to, like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I've been here 15 years," and so forth. So it's not that much of a culture shock.
Right.
I think people seem a lot more relaxed. Obviously, in terms of ethnic minorities, it's much smaller here, but I've not had any issues around that, and it's been unpleasant.
Good, good.
I think there's a great, welcoming quality about uh, Hastings. Even people that are born and bred here are just so friendly and
Mm.
really nice.
Mm.
Walk down the streets, and people just say hello to you and how are you? It's quite different, and you've got a
Mm.
mix of people that have got their roots here, and then you've got people like me, and there's people that have been here, moved about 15, 20 years ago. And there's a kind of growing young population, because Brighton University's got its campus, one of its campuses here. And
Right,
you've got a real
right.
mix of, and also I think with Brexit, I think Hastings had 55% leave vote.
Right, so
Which was,
so so you're so you're in slightly better company than you would have been in London.
yeah, not that I've met any Brexiteers. I think the ones I've met in the pub so far are all a bit like, oh, bloody Brexit. I think it's all the travel and
Right,
uh,
sure,
you
sure,
know,
sure. We'll start off with books.
Hmm.
What is your first pick?
So, yeah, three books. I think the first pick I decided to choose V.S. Naipaul's The Enigma of Arrival.
Mm.
And it's funny because I've read quite a lot of V.S. Naipaul, but I only came to reading that one last year at the very beginning of lockdown. And it felt like such an important book to read because um, it's very much very melancholic. It's very much a book about solitude and
Mm.
solitariness. And V.S. Naipaul, Indian ancestry, born in Trinidad, came to the UK in the late 50s and worked for the BBC. And I think this whole idea of arriving is a big theme, and finding what is a sense of home and place.
Mm.
The book is very thinly autobiographical, really, but it's almost like a prose poem. It's in 5 parts, and it's set in Salisbury, where he moved in Wiltshire. And so that whole sense of finding the sense of his connection to what seems like a very alien land, in the middle of rural England in Wiltshire, and living by himself in the estate of a kind of dilapidated country estate. And it's such a, it feels to me such an important novel. Not a lot happens in it. It's very much so detailed in terms of observation, the
Those
observation of nature.
those are really fun novels to read, though. I find that my favorite writers, Evelyn Waugh, Somerset Maugham, they sort of do that same thing too, where they cover a very long period of time, almost like an entire lifetime, and it's sort of it's more about kind of relationships and that's and the like than it is about sort of a clear narrative. It's also it's important, I think, to have at least one or two books in your collection where it almost feels like the character is yourself in an alternate timeline. I mean, do you find that it mirrors your own life, being that it's about a wandering traveller who leaves the West Indies for England?
Yeah, I do have a sense of that. There's a sense that resonates with me. That experience of again, myself of Indian ancestry, born in Mauritius. My parents came to London in the mid '60s, so and now here I am in Hastings. This very which, like V.S. Naipaul, when I walk up to uphill and I just look at the coastline, the physical beauty is just stunning. It really does at some points really kind of suit me. It also still feels a bit unusual. There's a sort of newness about it. It's almost exotic in that sense. But also it's connected. I think what I find is having been such an urban kind of individual, moving into this new home. I'm negotiating so much internally, and so emotionally and physically, I'm kind of starting to feel that there's something that I'm trying to understand, although I'm not as much of a loner as V.S. Naipaul is. I think V.S. Naipaul's kind of solitariness is, I'm not sure if I could manage that way. You just write and you walk and you think and you experience that connection with nature. Although I'm starting to slow down and maybe kind of start to think that, but it doesn't. It's not a sort of hippie naturist or anything like that. I mean, what he talks about is the beauty of the land and the beauty of the connections between empire, Britain, the colonies, and but he does it with a sort of real sense of a meditative approach. He's not talking about, this is the shit that empire's created. He talks very much, I suppose, about what there's a historical connection that brings everyone together. And he talks about, as an excerpt from his book, where he says that's the guy who owns the land and he's renting a cottage in this guy's land. That there's the kind of incredible sympathy for him. The landlord's become a recluse. He's the estate is kind of going to ruins, and so there's a lot of metaphor there, I think. But the estate is worth a lot of money, but it's in sort of this almost semi-derelict state. And but it talks very much. He goes, it's just that his meditations on the manor was not one of imperial decline. And a quote, he says, rather, I wondered at the historical chain that had brought us together. He in his house, I in his cottage, the world garden, his taste, as I was told, and also my taste. So things are brought together. There's a common experience that, even though there's sort of what could be seen as disparate experiences. That's what I think I like about Naipaul. He just looks at the kind of human condition that.
There's also a almost like a meta thing going on there. You're talking about connections where the character of the landlord, I read in my research, is modeled off of a real life socialite who was one of the bright young things in the 20s, who, as I mentioned earlier, even in war, wrote about in one of his books, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much connection between Naipaul, Even in War, and Somerset Maugham. And I mean, Somerset Maugham was certainly a writer that he admired in his early years, in Naipaul's early years. And so I think that's what I like, is this kind of contemplation. There is a malaise, there is definitely a sadness, and perhaps, you see that in a more comedic way in Naipaul's early novels, which are wonderful to read. They're kind of a lot more light-hearted. But I think for last year, I just kind of felt that I needed to read this novel and stay with it, because there's something about this, solitariness and this isolation, and it kind of connected with me. And I think I'm not in total isolation, but I certainly feel there's a sort of difference of not being in the buzz and the hum of London and the kind of non-stop kind of sense of lots of people on the streets, lots of traffic, lots of e-scooters whizzing past you and stuff like that. I'm starting to feel that maybe I'm becoming a bit more meditative. So it's a beautiful book, and also just the painting that was inspired the title of the book. Maybe, the idea that we all start to feel a sense of greater loneliness, perhaps a greater solitariness as we start to get older, and how we negotiate that is really powerful. That's quite universal, I think. So beautiful book, so gorgeously written. It's beautiful. It's a prose poem, really. It's wonderful.
Wonderful, great. Okay, so let's move on to book two, and this is a book that I read not too long ago, but I really loved it. It's The Human Stain by Philip Roth.
Yeah. So The Human Stain by Philip Roth, again, I think is, I haven't read it for one, but I did read it when it came out in 2001 or so. And I mean, it's that opening sequence of that, at the time of Bill Clinton's scandal, and with Monica Lewinsky, but that was the sort of buzz, and then suddenly it kind of focuses down on the university campus, and a professor is fired for alleged racism against 3 African American pupils who he calls he uses the word spooks, and his interpretation was that they just didn't know what turning up to classes. And he said, you know, where are these 3 students? And, you know, are they spooks? Right? Are they ghosts that you never hear? And there's a massive complaint, and he is forced to leave his position. But then what transpires in the novel, which is again, you know, such a powerful novel, is that the professor is passing as white, that he black ancestry, and he severed his relationship between his black family in order to get through you know, what was a very divisive America at the time.
Yeah, it's like a poetic tragedy, right? Where is it so he passes as Jewish, so they
Right.
can
Yeah.
so they can fight in the war, and then ends up marrying a Jewish girl and living his life in almost denial. Like it's like they're saying, you know, when you keep lying to yourself, eventually you believe it, and then ultimately he gets, you know, obviously the term wasn't around then, but he gets cancelled.
Yeah, he gets cancelled. But also, it's a kind of interesting commentary, I think, again, so pertinent to our times in terms of education and learning and knowledge. And you know, there's a really good quote, which that was in 2001. It could be easily applied to 20 years later, where he talks about that, you know, if someone wasn't a good learner, wasn't picking things up, you know, then that person was the you know, that the person fell short, that he or she needs to kind of, you know, work harder, you know, apply him or herself to it a lot more, be more disciplined. And, you know, either that or you drop out of the course saying it's not for me or something. But he talks about that it's no longer the pupil, the students that are blamed for the shortcomings or shortfalls in education. It's the discipline. And there's a great quote where he says, you know, reading the classics is too difficult. Therefore, it's the classics that are to blame. And he says, today the student asserts his incapacity as a privilege. Today the student asserts his incapacity as a privilege. I can't learn it, so there is something wrong with it. And there is something especially wrong with the bad teacher who wants to teach it. There are no more criteria, only opinions. And that is so true. You know, where we're talking about, you know, that we need to accept students' spelling mistakes. We need, because, you know, suddenly good punctuation and grammar is colonialist or supremacist or something. You know, we again, you know, kind of just absurdities, which almost feels like straight out of Philip Roth's novel. And then, yes, you know, you're reading about articles about people that, although they're not physically much, you know, lighter skinned, being accused of passing as white. And I think what I like about Roth, firstly, I'm a big fan of Roth, as I'm a big fan of Naipaul, so just devour Roth especially, because it's, you know, every book that was coming out, I would just run to the bookshop and order it or buy it. And so, yeah, 2 great losses in literature, I think, 2 literary giants. But I think the performance of the protagonist, you know, is something that, you know, everything was a performance. But, you know, how authentic was that? And the whole idea of sort of, it asks a lot of questions about, you know, authenticity, but also escaping. So, you know, would he have been able to be a professor of classics if he was visibly black? You know, would he have got the sack if he was visibly black? But also the love story in the film. Well, I won't talk about the film. The film's quite disappointing, I think.
Right. Yeah. So the love story again, it ties into the theme is sort of, you know, being a pariah, being an outsider. He ends up with a lowly janitor at the university,
Sort of scorpion.
and he's sort of, you know, he's already been ousted by the students, and now he's ousted by the faculty.
That's right. Yeah. So I think again, you know, there's all those sort of traversing of what seem like social cultural barriers, and you know, the Jewish passing as Jew, as Jewish. The love affair with I can't remember if she was Jewish or not, or whether she was.
I don't
I
think
don't
she.
think she
I don't
was.
think. I think
No,
she was.
no, she wasn't.
His wife was Jewish, but he's no.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the janitor, is played by Nicole Kidman in the film. It's quite bizarre, because I'm sure it's quite different. Philip Roth apparently, when he went to see the film, just kind of chuckled in the back seat.
Mm, mm,
Whole thing. But again, I think it's these connections that I admire about Roth. From a lot of his writings about blue collar experiences, the kind of solitary individual trying to make sense of it. That
mm.
whole trilogy of American Pastoral, Human Stain, I Married a Communist, just incredible, I think, statements. Great American novels, to be honest.
Yeah, because you think of the Great American novels being published in sort of the early century, right? You think of Jack Kerouac and Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck. You don't think of the sort of end of history 1990s post Cold War, but that's just as much a period of sort of stagnation and desperation as any other time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think there are sort of state of the nation novels around that time from
Mm.
post post war 50s America to the end of the century. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because to me, a great novel has one job, and that's to sort of capture a zeitgeist, right? And it's interesting that it brings in it heavily references the sort of the Clinton era.
Mm.
That's quite interesting. Also, again, you talk about things sort of breaking apart and coming back together again. There's also weird bits of connection where Silk and the janitor die in a car crash. Who the janitor's husband is suspected, and at the end, the husband and the narrator end up together, and it's strange how it works.
I think it's one that I want to read again because it's been 20 years and I kind of feel that it warrants a reread. And Roth is such a visceral writer too, very muscular in that sense. But great observations on love and messiness of love, and the kind of just that it's so
Yeah,
visceral.
and sort of the loss of control in your life that
Mm,
that
mm,
people feel sort of at some point that kind of youthful naivety of the world is my oyster, I'm going to run into it and make it my own, that kind of fizzles away and is replaced by something far more real, as in you don't have control. The words you say, saying the word spooks, regardless of how you meant it, can end your career.
yeah,
um
exactly.
yeah.
We see a lot of that at the moment.
Yeah,
Stuff taken
yeah,
from
absolutely, absolutely.
misquoted, and fulfilling someone else's narrative.
Mm, mm,
What I think people should really read it because I think it just humanises so much about that there is.
mm,
We are agents that can create our own kind of narratives in that sense,
mm,
destiny. So the sense of human agency for a person to, knowingly divorce his ethnic, cultural, historical background to reinvent himself
mm,
is a really interesting story.
But also, there's almost a caution around lying, though, right? Because I mean, I mean, going back to your first choice, sort of not necessarily isolation or loneliness, but being alone is a theme, and with the fact that he's split from his family and his kids have no idea what his real ethnic background is. He's sort of in that lie. He's alone.
He is alone. That's
Yeah.
true. Yeah, I think because not being able to negotiate that, and obviously, I think a lot of people of the time did it as a necessity to get out of what was still highly racist nation, and when you're able to pass as white, you were able to do other things. You weren't going to be working as a janitor or cleaning, as a cleaner or something like that. You could have possibilities of entering the wider world, and some people did it as a means of survival. But also, tragically, it meant that they severed any kind of ties with their past. So that kind of alienation and solitariness and loneliness must be quite strong.
Yes. Let's move on to your third book, and it's different from the others in that it's non-fiction.
Yeah, so it's Camille Paglia, who again I think is a wonderful writer. I like that she just writes in such. She writes for an audience that is not an academic audience,
right?
Writes for your everyday reader, but she's an intellectual, real force, great thinker.
She talks. She talks in a really incredible way. It's very captivating the way she talks, isn't it? She's always she dominates every conversation she's in.
Yeah, she's a motor mouth, without a doubt.
Yeah.
I love her. It's almost like a sort of stream of consciousness. How she speaks. But Glittering Images, which came out in 2012, it's just a wonderful collection of Camille Paglia's selection of about 29 images through art history. It seemed quite arbitrary, but she does try and find a thread as to why, and she makes a case for why she selected these images. Everything from classical, ancient Egypt to the last image that she selects from. I'll talk a bit about that because it's so problematic. From George Lucas's one of his Star Wars films, and but the thing is that she writes again, not in a sort of art historical or academic or scholarly way. It's about what these images, what these entities mean to her, and sometimes you can think, well, do you really believe that George Lucas is the, what she said, how she described him? It's probably the most recent, greatest work of art that she's seen, in terms of the visual arts. And we're thinking, really, Revenge of the Sith, that final scene where, which I watched after reading Glittering Images, and yes, I mean, I could see her point. Technology was evolving, and obviously, art and technology is becoming so much more de rigueur as a kind of medium through video art and through interactive art and augmented reality and so forth, and visual effects, and so forth.
She speaks quite clearly about visual overload, right? I mean, how due to mass media, we're desensitized to visual art and that sort of thing, and how through like advertising, which is designed to almost like hack your brain into buying things, that the sort of the part of the human psyche that is reserved for imagery and art is kind of tainted. In a sense, because it begins with ancient Egypt and it ends with Star Wars, and it's quite a fascinating look at how the way we pursue art that transcends our daily lives has changed in a couple of thousand years. Where in Egypt it's about transcending death. She writes about how the figures were sort of seen as being levitating, neither here nor there. It's aesthetic. It's in service to a higher being. And then you go to Star Wars, where it's just escapism, right? It's not in service of anything other than entertainment.
That's right. I mean, and I suppose maybe she started to feel that contemporary visual arts is just going up its own arse, speaking to a very small audience. It becomes sermonizing, or it becomes inaccessible. So perhaps she just wanted to kind of put this dare to say, what is a contemporary work of art that can still have mass appeal. there's so many wonderful pieces in that. Jackson Pollock, Picasso, Demaswell, Davignon, and even some others that perhaps might be great artists, but certainly popular without a doubt. And I like that how she does marry high art with popular arts in that sense. So for her,
you were about to say low art, weren't you?
I was about to say low art. Stop myself. Censor myself. high and low art. Yeah. The vulgar arts. Entertainment, not art. So to put Revenge of the Sith and that kind of final scene where Luke Skywalker's fighting with his dad Darth Vader in the sort of volcanic planet, I suppose at that time the technology was pretty dazzling. It was it did feel very painterly. I remember sort of looking at some years ago, and sometimes it kind of reminded me of some of the backdrops of like Black Narcissus, Powell's film, and so there's something, there's a tradition there, and some of that can feel quite beautiful in that sense. So, but is it? I mean, what she says is that nothing I saw in the visual arts of the past 30 years was as daring, beautiful, and emotionally compelling as the spectacular volcano planet climax of Lucas's Revenge of the Sith. And that he turns dazzling new technology into an expressive personal genre. Tall order, but I like the challenge that she gives.
Yeah, in a sense, I feel more wonderment when I'm watching the original Star Wars, just because I know that it's sort of more DIY in the visual effects, where because I guess I'm a native of CGI film. I was born in the mid-90s, so I don't it's like I look back at old episodes of like Doctor Who, and it's basically just like a play on television, and someone gets hit with a whisk, and you're like, oh my god, he's dead. Like you have to like really like spend your disbelief.
Completely,
But,
that one bloke is in
yeah, but I think a sign of my sort of early onset cynicism. I get a sort of uncanny valley feel when I see like CGI. So for that reason, I mean, the originals have always sort of meant more to me than the more recent ones.
I think probably Revenge of the Sith was the beginning of that kind of dazzling, kind of.
Yeah, the first two reboot movies look really tacky when you look back at them.
Yeah, they do look very tacky. Obviously, they've kind of cleaned it up now with post-production, digitization, and so forth to make it look less tacky. But it is incredible that it was quite dazzling in 1976 to see the first Star Wars, and then it was,
Let's move along again to music, which is so looking at the your list here. I'm quite surprised. So your first pick is Diamond Dogs by David Bowie, which is not the Bowie album that most people would go for. I mean, you think of Rise and Fall, Hunky Dory, Heroes. So why this one?
Well, I was 11 when Diamond Dogs came out, and a cousin of mine who was living with us bought the album. And prior to that, I was listening to Mud, Suzi Quattro. I was not into the Bay City Rollers, but my sister was into the Bay City Rollers. So that was that kind of 11-year-old pop sort of stuff. And then I heard Diamond Dogs. My cousin put it on my dad's stereo, and it just, I've never heard anything like this. So while Bowie's earlier stuff might still kind of fit into something that was a bit like sort of glam or pop, it's still Hunky Dory was perhaps a bit more folksy. But Diamond Dogs, that opening poem, spoken word piece, End in the Death and the Last, and this kind of crazy sci-fi urban apocalyptic world of half human, half dog creatures, kind of scavenging some sort of desolate cityscapes. Really, just kind of opened my imagination to something, and the whole of the album is pretty dark, actually. Certainly one of Bowie's darker albums, and inspired by half a dozen of the songs are inspired by George Orwell's 1984. And I think what that album did for me was it created a real kind of visual landscape. It was telling stories that were at times surreal, at times kind of real, because you kind of get a sense of this sort of decaying cityscapes, of maybe America, or some bombed out Los Angeles or something like that. And I think what Bowie does so well is create these kind of surreal images with his writings and his music. And that came out so well in Diamond Dogs. It just opened another world to me. And I was like, just listen to it. And the B-side of the album, which I suppose is more references 1984, a lot more. So We Are the Dead, 1984, Big Brother. And I was 11 at the time, so then I found out it was based on George Orwell's 1984. So I read George Orwell's 1984, and then I read, heard about cut-up technique, and how Bowie wrote some of the songs, particularly on the first side of the album, and that it was inspired by William Burroughs. I started to read William. It opens just a new aspect of literature to me too. What I think is why I chose Diamond Dogs, there's so many Bowie albums I could have chosen, but it was the first one I listened to from inside out, up teen times, at that very young age. I think it holds a lot of resonance about the idea of authoritarianism, losing any sense of individuality, and bowing to some kind of almost godlike, greater, nefarious state.
I mean, obviously, I can only say this, looking back and trying to basing it off of limited cultural references, but the mid 70s feels like quite a, not necessarily bleak, but it's like the 60s is over now. Exactly. It's post Watergate. The sort of, it felt like the flower power had gone, and the man was back. But also it feels like a very important album for Bowie himself. I mean, he's trying to break away from Ziggy Stardust. I believe prior to the record, he broke up the Spiders from Mars, and he fired his producer. Which so it's 74. Glam rock isn't really cool anymore. Punk's on the horizon. It's almost like he needed something to sort of reinvent himself in between Ziggy Stardust and the sort of the Berlin era.
I think also the perhaps that whole experience of the USA and sort of almost surrealness of somewhere like LA, and Hollywood's sort of culture. Really, plays out in some of the songs like Sweet Thing and Candidates. But he wanted to create, I think, a musical theatre or music theatre piece on 1984, but wasn't given the rights. So it's a bit of a jumbled album in that sense, but I think it does still come together. And also Bowie was almost like he did cast himself adrift, where he plays quite a lot of the instruments on that album. I think there's some sort of ways that he's working with sound and stuff like that that starts to become a bit more experimental. Repetition and kind of crashing and stuff, which starts to feature a bit more in the Berlin stuff, and it's an amazing album cover. I think it's an incredible work of art. It's just like look at it, thinking, my God, that's so something else. And the sort of hybrid creature.
Yeah,
Bowie, and
it's weird because he's still got the Ziggy Stardust hair.
that's right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so it
yeah. The
is.
red hair, makeup, and everything.
Yeah, but it looks kind of like sort of quite sort of zombified, right? The characters next to him,
Yeah,
yeah, they're like
yeah. It looks skeletal, and sort of. It almost feels that he's kind of become that androgyny becomes a bit darker
mm,
and a bit more dystopic in that sense.
mm,
But
mm.
also, I think I was going to choose Space Oddity because that was the first Bowie album I bought off my schoolmate. I think he stole it off his older brother for a quid. He kind of came with us. Yours for a quid, pound note. And but Signet Committee, which is an epic 10-minute piece on Space Oddity, does talk exactly like that sort of stuff. The disillusionment of the countercultural 60s flower power thing, and where it starts to get much darker and sort of the Manson thing and stuff like that.
I always found that the title track from Diamond Dogs sounded a bit like the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, there's sort of jangliness about it. It's true.
Yeah,
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 there is a kind of slightly raw, not too show-offy rock feel to it. It's not because Bowie's guitar playing is not that great.
right.
So there's a real sort of, it has got a jaggedness to it, which some of the Rolling Stones had. Yeah.
Let's move on to your second album, and before we do, I do actually have quite a funny story about it. So the choice is "Purple Rain" by Prince, which is a phenomenal record. The title track is one of the most well-known songs ever written. So yeah, the story about this is that when I was about 20, so about 4 years ago, I just got into vinyl. And I was in an Oxfam looking at the records, and they had Purple Rain for £3, right? I was like, I'm getting that. Bought it. Went to the counter to buy it, and they asked me, "Are you sure is the record inside?" So I checked. Saw actually pulled it out a little bit. Saw the black vinyl. I was like, "Yeah, record's inside." Took it home. Went to put it on. Opened it out. The wrong record was inside. It wasn't Purple Rain. What it was Back to Front by Gilbert O'Sullivan. And so I listened to that, and honestly, after that, he became my favorite singer for like a couple of years after that, Gilbert Sullivan. But I ended up actually getting Purple Rain in the end. But yeah, there's a bit of serendipity there. But yeah, Purple Rain.
Yeah, because Gilbert Sullivan was like a bit of a footnote in music, really, doesn't he?
Yeah, he was he was
big in the 70s, yeah.
he was very big for a time, and then it just sort of fizzled out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it wasn't for that, clerical error in Oxfam, I probably would never have heard of him. But let's talk about Purple Rain then. Obviously, everyone knows the title track, but what about the rest of the record?
Yeah, the rest of the record's wonderful. I think the opening song, "Let's Go Crazy," is one of the greatest opening tracks of pop music.
Sorry, just like playing it.
So "Let's Go Crazy," dearly beloved, we are gathered here to celebrate this thing called life, and then he just kicks off with this incredible riff, and it's almost a kind of anthem to live your life at its fullest, because we only got one life, and let's go crazy. So I think it's times when obviously quite a lot of the stuff I've been referring to is a bit dark and a bit lonely and a bit and I just need to put on that opening track and just feel incredibly kind of just want to jump around and do the guitar solo and stuff like that. But I think that's what I like about Prince, and again, I suppose when Bowie was starting to maybe become less affected, perhaps. This new persona turns up, who's again, very ambiguous in his look, and
he's quite Byronic as well, right?
Yeah, very Byronic, very romantic. All those thrills, and also it's the time of the sort of new romantic thing in pop. That's obviously bigger here, but I think what I liked about Prince, he kind of so eclectic in terms of how he kind of put himself, constructed his persona. One of the previous songs before on Purple Rain, am I black, am I white, am I straight, am I gay, controversy, and you just see that playing out. And I loved his band. He had women in his band, and they were looking pretty sexy too. And again, sort of very French, aristocratic, slightly decadent. Kind of playfulness with of his stage acts and stuff. Very sexual. Little Richard, bit of Hendrix, bit of James Brown,
right?
And electronic, sort of that 1980s electro kind of vibe to it. So there's some great songs, and I Would Die For You, I think, is one of the most beautiful songs as a love song. Computer Love, I think, is again prophetic. We are literally kind of having digitized relationships through online dating to videos, sort of camcorder stuff, and it just becomes this idea that we are the album. I think is again there's a sort of real strong physicality to it, but I think it's kind of nodding to what the world is looking like in the technological age with regards to and there's some commonality with Bowie in that sense. But the great thing about Prince, towards he became so anti-technology, even though at that time he was starting to embrace aspects of the internet and stuff that started to develop. And Computer Love, I think, is a sort of track that kind of is the root of something that now is so everywhere in social media and dating apps and sex cam stuff and sexting and texting, all that kind of stuff. It's just like another world. And that kind of loss of the physical human touch. And a recent, before Prince died, someone was saying that interviewing him, said you don't do Instagram, you don't do social media, you don't. He goes, no, I don't even own a phone, a smartphone, and she says, yeah, he just wants to escape from technology. So in the end, he just stepped back from it and found it very, very worrisome. Yeah.
Almost as if on cue your phone goes off.
No, yes, my messenger.
Prince is a fascinating person and artist. I mean, I think confusion is a big part of his kind of mystique, right? I mean, obviously, there's two words of the same coin. Even when he because at one point he just went by a symbol, right? He wasn't he wasn't Prince. He was the artist formerly known as Prince.
That's right. Yeah. So this non-pronounceable visual symbol. And yeah, I mean, he I think he just wanted to be his own person, his own man.
And he was
independence from corporates, and I think that's important. As a sort of.
It's interesting that you chose both Bowie and Prince because they died very very close together, didn't they? They like same month, wasn't it?
Yeah, same year, and it was like 2015, wasn't it?
16, I believe. 16.
16, yes. And I just thought, oh my God, what the hell's going on? And it felt so awful musically. That two of my icons. I had Prince. Far too young to go.
Sure. That's the thing when an artist dies, is that suddenly their music becomes finite. Suddenly there is a fixed amount of it, and that's it. You can now listen to every song he'll ever produce, and it's quite surreal.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah. I had that when Leonard Cohen died, in the same year actually. Where I then went and listened, because I'm a big fan of Leonard Cohen, so I went back and listened to all of his stuff again, and then I finished it, and I was like, wow, that's it. I've finished Leonard Cohen's. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, it's
his body of work. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, but also there is there's an immortality in that, because they're going to be infinite new people who are going to find Prince and listen to that and connect with that, and that in that he'll never really die.
No, he won't. And his inspiration, he will carry on through the inspiration he gives to so many musicians. And, it's a touchstone, definitely. Yeah.
Let's move along before we get too emotional.
Cool.
So the third one on your list is a single song, but it's 15 minutes long, so it's it works, and it's A Day in America by Sun Kil Moon, which I hadn't heard before, but I listened to it this morning.
Right.
It's it paints America as almost a revolving tragedy, right?
Yeah.
It depicts at the start, it depicts a school shooting, and how nothing will change, and this is just going to keep happening, and it's almost like there's a conversive nature to it, where it's like, oh, there's been a shooting. Oh, where? Florida. How many? About 14. It's almost like you're talking about like a sports score, rather than a massacre.
Yeah. Again, it's something that haunts us a lot, from Columbine to obviously Mark Kozlov, who's the writer and singer, with his sort of small band. So yeah, he did release that song not long after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, where a 19-year-old killed 17 students and fellow and teachers on Valentine's Day, and another 17 were seriously injured. Was fatal. I think that what is so haunting about this song, like you said, it's 15 minutes long. What I like about Mark Kozlov, and I think the first time I heard, he just came on, and this is where the algorithms of Spotify can get it right. I was just lounging and probably wallowing in my bath for a long time, and another song from Sun Kil Moon's came on called "I Love Portugal," and my ears just pricked up, because he it's just rambling away, and again, I think because of the sort of the gun culture in the USA, he wanted to have this escape, going to Portugal, and just live a life away from the USA, and this kind of violence that is explored in A Day in America. So quite a lot of some of his songs are about these horrific moments, school of shootings, of massacres. But what I think I like about it's not, of course, it's a commentary on gun culture in the USA, and these kind of what seems like senseless massacres by quite some fellow teenagers. But there's something it brought me to mind also of in 2018, the Manchester bombing at Ariana Grande's concert, where 22 people were killed through horrific Islamist terrorist suicide bombing, and so these kind of things of what's going on with these kind of troubled teenagers in the USA on one side, but also these kind of not very old Islamist terrorists and bombers and suicide, sort of nihilism and hatred. So, and what I think Mark Kozlov does in this song is he does show his hatred for this. He's quite. There's a point in the lyrics where he says, it says, I think they should. He goes, I think they should go Django Unchained on the killer they caught, hang him upside down and cut off his balls. Escorting this man from the planet is in everyone's best interest. When a guy kills 17 kids, dispose of him quick and fast. No, I mean, no one's going to talk like that. No one's written a song about the suicide bomber, Ariana Grande's concert, for example, with that kind of moments of high emotion about, the senselessness or the hatred or the evil, and the victim blaming that goes on with with these killers. And in the case of Sun Kill Moon Song, Nicholas Cruz seems like a troubled teenager, and has all the kind of tropes of being sort of troubled teenager, in that kind of tick box dysfunctionalism. And his trial's due to happen later this year, I think. There's a point where you just kind of think, do you care about this individual anymore? And I think that's what's, Mark Kozlov, he allows that anger to be expressed.
Yeah, because that is in many ways your first response when you hear about something as heinous as that. Is you almost become the not necessarily you become the killer, but you that same instinct to harm comes to you, but it's directed towards the one who does the harm. You almost complete the cycle in a way when you have that sort of revenge fantasy on the person who's done this.
Yeah, exactly. So and the song doesn't dwell on that. It's just that moment. I mean, like it's a really long song, so a lot more is going on in it.
There's a bit where he puts the GOP in the crosshairs, where he sort of he says he repeats that the Republicans want the right to bear arms. He sort of brings back in this problem goes beyond the school. It goes up into the halls of power, and nothing's really being done about this apart from a week of mourning, promises to do something about this, and then ultimately it gets forgotten about until the next tragedy.
Yeah, and so it is quite explicit that he's calling for more gun control, and I think yes, you can't have people walking around with an object that can destroy. Obviously, we have knife crime here and stuff like that, but and you can kill lots of people. I mean, obviously, we've seen other horrors in this country of just multiple stabbings and so forth. So yes, do you blame the tool? Do you blame the individual? And I think it's a combination of both, and there needs to be some degree of balance and control within that.
The song sonically is quite interesting too. I mean, if you look just completely beyond the lyrics and the subject, it's a very interesting blend of sound. It's sort of, the backing is quite jazzy. It's quite it's almost like a crooner in a jazz bar, kind of sauntering around and kind of. But the vocals, it feels like it's quite hip hop-ish, right? There's a flow and a swagger to it, and it's almost like he's sort of he's like preaching, and it's like it's
a lot of his songs are like that, and I think they do become like sort of spoken words, jazz poetry, or rambling. They just become because hardly any of his songs are short. They are 10 minutes, 15 minutes,
right?
And they tell the story. Sometimes they're quite they meander off into all kinds of thoughts and thinkings and observations and then conversations and dialogue, and then they just kind of come back in, and that's what I've. So here's one of my recentish discoveries about in the last 3 years. Because although he's made quite a lot of albums, but I just think, it's just nice to see a storyteller, that sort of jazz / folk tradition. But again, like you said, it's kind of got maybe that downbeat that hip hop has, but again, it's usually just a drum or a bass. It's not sampled or anything like that. I recommend that you listen to more of his stuff.
I will. Let's move on to movies. Or say movie, because we give you one, and it's a very fascinating film. It's Woody Allen's Sleeper, which is unlike anything else I've seen by Woody Allen. It's because Woody Allen's normally, it's normally he writes almost love letters to various cities, Paris and Midnight in Paris, mostly New York. But this is him going sort of into the unknown, which feels different for him, because normally he stays quite grounded and quite local, and it's all about an area. But what is, to anyone who hasn't seen it, what is Sleeper?
So Sleeper, yeah, it's a very funny film. Just you can hold your ribs, pain and laughter, and it's slapstick. It's it's sort of got Buster Keatonish kind of qualities to it, and it's Woody Allen. He's obviously everyone knows he's a great lover of sort of trad jazz, clarinet music and stuff. So he's just a kind of everyday guy, works in somewhere like Greenwich Village in some Whole Foods store and plays jazz at the local club, and he has an accident and then wakes up 200 years later in the future, and is cryogenically frozen or something and wakes up, and it's in a police state. Again, there's a sort of Big Brother quality about it, but again, it's much more light-hearted, and there's a revolutionary underground movement trying to overthrow what is seen as the sort of dictator who doesn't really exist.
Yeah, because they they managed to kill him earlier, but they didn't know, right?
That's right. Yeah, they didn't know, and but they've managed to preserve the dictator's nose, so they're going to recreate him. So they kind of have to capture the nose, but there's some fantastic scenes. Diane Keaton's in it, and it's kind of sex is again has been sanitized, and she comes back. It's a bit like Brave New World. The high on Soma.
Right. Yeah.
Nice sort of hippie thing. Yeah.
It's a good parallel to Brave New World, because in Brave New World the chains are sort of vice, right? It's what keeps people sort of subservient. Yeah, and there's interesting, because we mentioned with Diamond Dogs about how sort of the twilight of the 60s zeitgeist, and there's sort of there's a bit towards the end about free love, and him sort of trying to like talk her out of it, and pursue monogamy with him, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. So she falls for the sort of Che Guevara freedom fighter, romantic bearded kind of character, and that whole kind of idea of free love and revolution and stuff, and overthrowing the man. But great thing about Woody Allen, he doesn't take sides. He's kind of thinking, this kind of slightly communistic, revolutionary kind of fervor. He's cynical about. Obviously, he's anti this police state that's being created in this future that he finds. It's about individualism, but how he does it, the comedy is brilliant. It's so funny. I remember when I first saw it, and my sister, who's still at, how old would she have been? She would have been about 14 or something, or 13 at the time. And we used to watch it like every other day. I think we had the VHS cassette of it, and recorded it from television. And I made my mum watch it too, and she would, so literally, I think we watched it about 10, 15 times at that time in 1987. It came out in 73, I think. So I've never seen it before. And like his films like Manhattan or Annie Hall, are very much homages to the city, to the love affairs that kind of comes out of those out of that urban kind of culture. But Sleeper, it's Woody Allen at his most slapstick. It's
he's
a great visual comedian.
He redirects that pastiche towards not necessarily a place or a time, but it's more people like Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, as you mentioned. It's sort of it's a pastiche to the origins of comedy on film.
Yeah, and that moment when he's a robot, and
right, yeah.
So the meringue starts to kind of as a servant, and the sort of giant meringue gets out of control, and he's just like, trying to knock it back, so it doesn't appear and stuff. And as I say, he almost looks a bit like a Cyberman, and pretending to be the sort of butler robot. And there's some great classic scenes, and the giant nose, it's just so amazing. Yeah.
Yes. Let's move on to your inanimate object, and it's a painting, which I misread that as a zoot suits and a painting, but it's a painting called Zoot Suits.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, Zoot Suits is one of those lovely kind of attires that's very much post-war American, but also had a massive influence, again, sort of the demob suits and stuff like that. People kind of coming out, and obviously it was a very American thing, but the Caribbeans were still influenced by America at the time, even though there were British colonies, quite a lot of those islands. And then you had the Windrush generation, sort of from 1948 onwards, coming to the UK from Jamaica and Trinidad and so forth. And Edward Burrough is a lovely British painter, British artist. He was born actually not far from Hastings in Rye in Sussex in 1905. And what I like about Edward Burrough are his figurative pieces. He took a lot of inspiration from port cities, so quite a lot of his paintings were like in Marseille of sailors and pimps and prostitutes and stuff like that, or jazz clubs or coffee, not jazz clubs, but kind of bars and bistros and so forth. And so he captured a sort of urban sense of urbanness, both in the USA, again, fascination for Harlem, and in France, and then I suppose it's kind of more kind of British-based work. So Zoot Suits is a watercolor, an ink wash, and it was painted in 1948, and it depicts a London street scene of four guys from the Caribbean, Jamaicans, all very smartly dressed in their zoot suits, just hanging out on the streets. And it's kind of got this lovely teeming London life to it, because it's not there in the foreground of the painting. You've got the street life going on there. You've got what's seen again the kind of growth of coffee shops developing in London. London is starting to come into its own in the sort of post-war, in that post-war period. And the Zoot Suits, again, I like this connection that it was, you could almost think that, this is Harlem, and it's not, or this is, it's London, and it's a style. The Zoot Suit was very popular with them. With Italians and African Americans.
So the painter is white, right?
Yes, yeah, he's a white painter. Yeah,
sure. Yeah. So the first time I interviewed you on my other podcast, we spoke a little bit about sort of cultural blending between Caribbean youths and white working class youths. It seems like a I'm not sure what Edward Burroughs class is, but I mean it's an example of that it's sort of again it's melding of things, and it's quite interesting to see what looks like quite a well-to-do West London street. It's it's an interesting contrast.
Yeah. I mean, he liked his paintings were very much about street scenes, marketplaces, bars and cafes, and as I said, from Harlem, Montmartre, Marseille, Toulon, and they're always kind of peopled with these sort of shady characters, and I think this one in Soho is probably less shadier. It's like it is about these kind of new men, these new arrivals that came from off Tilbury Docks into London, and there's something about the awe of London, this bustling capital, this connection that you have again, think of Naipaul, with the British Empire, and being able to come to the UK without much need for bureaucratic visas and so forth. And so what I think is really lovely about it is there's a sort of welcoming thing. You know, the city has got a real mix of everything. So there's one little black and white moment in the painting of this, in the distance, of this woman staring out of a window. She looks quite ghostly in a sort of
Right.
you know, it's a sort of melancholy. And then it's the cafe, the Oxford Cafe. Again, people hanging out of that. You know, there's delivery trucks. There's teeming high street.
Mm.
The double-decker bus. You know, it just feels like this is what city life maybe should be. You know, without all the surveillance, protection.
Do you get a sense that she's looking at the men who are depicted, or is she just looking out the window, just sort of taking everything?
She's just looking out the window. Yeah, so it's just this sort of, you know, she doesn't look as if she's looking at the men, you know, at all. She's just looking lost and sad and you know, lonely. And so you kind of all these narratives, little mini narratives going on, as well as these four Caribbean men, you know, new arrivals, and smartly dressed, looking in awe at this new city. And you know, it kind of connects with this brilliant song by Lord Kitchener about the Windrush generation, a song called "London Is the Place for Me." But that's another thing. I shouldn't delve into segueing into something else. But you know, it is about this sort of welcoming quality. You know, there's a sense of sociableness. You don't. These four individuals do not look as if they're alienated. They look as if they are in awe of what they're seeing. But they're excited. There's a sense of excitement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then they're not, and they're not like disrupting the scene. They kind of they become part of it. It's it seems quite aspirational for the Windrush generation in a sense.
But also how the UK was starting to change, where you know, getting more influenced by American, European culture. There's other artifacts and examples and books and stuff that starts to talk about, like, you know, the introduction of jazz music, calypso music started to come in, and you know, coffee clubs, you know, which didn't really exist, you know, then they start to come in the 50s. So it's a wonderful painting, watercolor painting. I think that just starts to look at London post-war being kind of, you know, a renaissance of a different sense.
Yeah, and now we move on to your historical and contemporary figures, which is I find the most interesting ones to go into, because you know, it's sort of, you know, it tells sort of a lot about what you sort of see and want to see in other people, what sort of, you know, traits you personally venerate without even necessarily realizing it. Your first choice is a man called Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a very influential abolitionist. What is it about the man, aside from, you know, the obvious in that sort of resonates with you personally?
I think what is so inspirational about Frederick Douglass is he was quite objective about slavery, even though he felt the brunt of it. He was able to find a way of using reason and philosophical approach to argue against it, and his encounter with his owner was very much based on a rational kind of debates and dialogues, you know, for human freedom, and that no one should own another person as if he or she was chattel or a non-human entity. And but what's amazing about Frederick Douglass was, you know, how he was educated and how he became such a great orator, and how he, I think, found his own way of looking at the idea of what are the sort of the three American things of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he was is someone that I think transcends left and right in contemporary politics. So a lot of people will kind of talk about so and so, revolutionary hero and stuff. And while there's some amazing qualities in those individuals, Frederick Douglass was, I think, such a great intellect, a man of letters, a thinker and a philosopher, very inspired by Enlightenment thinking, and also one of the most powerful things that he wrote, which was delivered as a speech, is called A Plea for Free Speech. And when I read that, it just encapsulates everything that is so important about freedom of speech, the right to express it, but also that you cannot suppress the right to other people to hear it. And it was in Boston, abolitionist gathering, and it was raided by, I suppose, the oppositional who tried to disrupt the meeting. And the mayor of Boston, in the end, bans the meeting from taking place, and didn't allow it to happen because it was such it could have got so potentially violent. And so Douglass, gave this 7-8 minute speech, pleading for the right to free speech, and no matter what, you cannot suppress freedom of expression and freedom of speech, whether it's pro or against something. And the right to hear something that you don't like is as important as the right to hear something that you might agree with.
Which a lot of people need to hear today. Another thing about him is that he was in his sort of fierce intellect and great oratory skills. He was a living refutation of the claim among slave owners that African Americans lacked the capacity intellectually to be free men. He was sort of again he in his nature, in his life, he just very calmly, very elegantly was a counterexample of that.
Absolute counterexample, yeah. And I think he was also, he kind of he influenced Abraham Lincoln, and he was very much the person who campaigned strongly that in terms of the Unionist and situation in the Civil War, that Abraham Lincoln had to go one step further. So the powers of persuasion. I remember reading this, that how he persuaded Lincoln to take on the anti-slavery, to embrace the anti-slavery movement, because at first I think there was some pragmatic thinking that he was having about how to come to find a deal with the South and stuff. But Douglas's kind of powers of reason, powers of argument, changed Abraham Lincoln's perspective and thinking on abolition, and I think that's such an important quality to remember. Is that through argument, through rational debate, through reason, you have the ability to get someone to reconsider, to rethink their position. Not
the really sad thing to me was that his statue was vandalized and torn down last summer.
Yeah. Obviously, the whole hysteria on statues that went to kind of crazy proportions of both the people on the right or the left. Certainly more so on the left, and I suppose there's a lot of retaliation as a result that happens. It just feels like this madness of wanting to erase history, and I think if Douglass were alive, he would not say, let's tear down statues of Confederates. I think he would still see that it is part of history, it is part of a context, and You know,
The
that's
scars. The
yeah,
scars. Yeah.
the scars, as well as that you know, the complications of life, and we can look back hopefully with a bit more dignity, compassion, and rationality about it all. Yeah.
Mm. Your contemporary figure is Nina Power, who
Nina, yes.
I haven't heard of before, and I was hoping you could give me an introduction. I purposely didn't research this one just so I could hear sort of, you know, her through your words.
Yeah, so she's very contemporary. She's a writer, philosopher. She used to write music reviews for The Wire, so very, very into, I suppose, experimental alternative music. And she's got a book coming out this summer called What Do Men Want? I kind of knew of Nina Powell. She wrote a book about 10 years ago on, you know, I suppose a particular wave of feminism called One Dimensional Woman. So she was always on the left, and I think, you know, she would still say she's broadly on the left, but it's kind of gone through a journey of being the angry kind of left to something that's a bit more nuanced and a bit more esoteric, I suppose. So her writing, she's been writing for some columns for the Telegraph recently, again on cancel culture. She was a victim of a very dishonest and horrible attack, being accused of being transphobic, which caused a lot of caused a lot of hardship. She lost her contract with the Wire magazine, who said that, you know, we're not going to employ her anymore, for example. She was getting vilified by students and young academics who would say, you know, they wouldn't speak on the same platform as her, or, you know, they would urge certain universities and to cancel her, to deplatform her. So she kind of comes from that background, but also she's an incredible thinker. She writes her blog. You know, it's kind of like prose poetry. It's philosophical. This little pamphlet book that came out by a sort of small independent press called Morbid Books. It's called Platforms, and it is a prose poem, and it's very confessional. It's very personal, and it's about the end of a love affair, a love relationship. At the end of the day, you know, sort of the madness of that, and the pain of it. You know, but it's kind of put in a very surreal journey. So it's addressed to a lover that remains unnamed. It's kind of almost partly stream of consciousness, automatic writing. It's quite trippy, almost hallucinogenic, but it throws in, you know, some of those ideas of, you know, some philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Kierkegaard and so forth. And there's something quite esoteric about it, about her thinking. So there's a sort of near mystical kind of visions that are going through it, but it's also, you know, it was written, was it last year at the time of lockdown? But it certainly feels that it feels like a story at the time of lockdown too. Lockdown 2020, and the end of an affair, end of a love affair. So, and also she's a friend, so kind of already kind of in all of her. So I wanted to kind of big up someone who I know, and so, you know, from her columns to in the Telegraph, she's not a regular columnist, but she's written a few columns on freedom of speech, on cancel culture, on the kind of the backlash against radical feminism.
It seems to me like a recurring theme in your choices here are almost iconoclasts and people who were, you know, almost I mean, it's been a bit of a dirty word, but almost subversive people who challenged their time. And you spoke to me last time. We talked about the backlash you received from the arts community due to your
Mm.
pro Brexit stance. Is that something that kind of at least subconsciously inspired your choices here? People who sooner or later became almost rejected because they told unfortunate truths.
I think definitely. And when I kind of go through my kind of cultural moments in my life, things that I didn't know about, like David Bowie, for example, in 1971, talking about the common market at the time, saying, we need to stop this before it's too late, almost like a revolution against joining the common market. And that kind of almost manifesting itself through, maybe not in a completely rational way, through Diamond Dogs, and the Big Brother scenario, and the idea of, that a state, a super state, now controls your life, or and it's not accountable. It's not something that we elect. It's not something that we give consent to govern us, but through a sort of neoliberal technocracy. So there's that, and I think with people like Nina, as as a sort of young contemporary thinker, she writes so much about deprogramming yourself from technology, from this kind of performativity through technology that we all are all obsessed with, and getting back to real tactile stuff, tactile experience, physical, the physicality of love, the physicality of books, the physicality of music, and nature, and getting lost in nature. So I'm kind of, I think, starting to find people who are starting to think maybe in radical ways, but slightly more esoteric ways too. That it's not just only rational enlightenment, but there is something else that I think we need to connect to, which perhaps is a bit more Jungian, perhaps is a bit more the unconscious, but also about the real, the power of nature, and the power of being alone in a space or with people. And sometimes the hedonism of stuff is really important, to not be, this sort of kind of po-faced, Voltairean or something. We need to have fun too. The subversion is really important. Yeah.
Manick Govinda, that was Your Life in 10.